We just decided we're going to pass the omnibus here with all the Republicans present. My apologies for being late. The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning. This is our second hearing in the 115th Congress, where we will review maritime transportation regulatory issues through two panels of witnesses. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. The question is on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Our second order of business is to welcome new members. Since our last hearing was interrupted and a little rushed due to House floor votes, there was not time to properly welcome the new members to the subcommittee. I welcome to the subcommittee Mr. Randy Weber, Senior, representative for the 14th District of Texas, who joins us from the Gulf Coast. He's not here, so we're not going to introduce him anymore. Brian Mast, not here, not going to introduce him. Mr. Jason Lewis, our Vice Chairman, not here. I will now yield to Ranking Member Garamonti to recognize his new members. You're recognized.
We note the Democrats present. And Alan Lowen sitting down at the other end, representing the great port of Long Beach and part of LA Port? Well, right up to the port. Right up to okay. Would you like to make a 20-minute statement on the value of the port of Long Beach? Not. Later, I'll defer. Okay, we'll defer. Welcome.
The LBC, right? Long Beach County, home of Sublime. It's a great place. I will now move on to opening statements. Since we have a full slate of witnesses, I'm going to go through the topics fairly quickly. The Oil Spill Pollution Act requires vessel owners and/or operators to have vessel response plans which address oil spills and salvage and firefighting response measures. The act requires vessel response plans to meet the national planning criteria, but there are areas of the country that, due to low population or vessel traffic, cannot and therefore use an alternative planning criteria. The Coast Guard's view is the alternative planning criteria is a temporary solution to reaching the national planning criteria, however long that might take. Another issue with the alternative planning criteria is whether or not it should cover the geographic area of the captain of the port zone. I'm interested to hear from the witnesses on these issues. The Coast Guard implements the Convention of Standards of Training and Certification Watchkeeping, which is designed to ensure seafarers are properly trained and certified. The Coast Guard will update us on their progress implementing this International Maritime Organization convention. While commercial fishing vessel exams are somewhat controversial with the industry, the Coast Guard will give us an update on where they are with the mandated program. The Towing Vessel Inspection Program may get the award for the longest ever regulatory process, lasting over 12 years. Having finally issued the rule last year, the Coast Guard will discuss its implementation. Lastly, U.S. industry has concerns with the Federal Maritime Commission's recent review of ocean carrier agreements. I commend the Commission for deciding not to approve an agreement for the companies that are in the process of merging to not extend prematurely antitrust immunity. The Commission and industry representatives will discuss this important issue today. Got something for me? I will now yield to Ranking Member Garamonti.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Given the hour, I think I will ask that my statement be entered into the record, and without objection, so ordered. Thank you. And simply say that there are some very, very important things going on here with regard to the regulation. I'm looking forward to this hearing. Of particular interest is the Federal Maritime Commission and their implementation of the Shipping Act as it revolves around the issue of the alliances and the impacts that that may have on providers of services. And finally, obviously, the Coast Guard, just to echo what you said, not echo it, just say, yes, you're on track. We need to hear from the Coast Guard on the regulatory issues. Obviously, it's very, very important that these regulations be done in a timely and proper way. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the Ranking Member. Pursuant to Rule 1A1 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I move that the Chairman be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. The question is on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. On our first panel, we will hear from Rear Admiral Paul Thomas, the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy of the Coast Guard, and Mr. Michael Corey, Acting Chairman for the Federal Maritime Commission. Admiral Thomas, you're recognized to give your statement.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamonti, distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's an honor for me to be here with you this morning to update you on the status of the Coast Guard Maritime Regulatory Program. Mr. Chairman, on behalf of Coast Guards, men and women everywhere, thank you for your leadership of this committee and continued strong support of our United States Coast Guard. As you know, the Coast Guard offers truly unique and enduring value to our nation. as the only branch of the U.S. Armed Services within the Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard is uniquely positioned to help secure the border, protect the homeland, and safeguard America's national and economic security. But, as our Commandant discussed with you during his April 4th hearing, increasing mission demands, years of fiscal constraint, and diminishing purchasing power of our operating funds has eroded our ability to simultaneously execute the full suite of missions and be prepared to respond to global contingencies. Secretary Kelly understands this, and he fully supports the President's call to rebuild all of our nation's armed services. Prudence demands that we invest in and rebuild Coast Guard capacity, including the capacity of our marine safety and regulatory programs, as they are key components to the Coast Guard's national and economic security missions. Our nation's marine transportation system supports over $4.5 trillion of economic activity and hundreds of thousands of American jobs. The Coast Guard's governance of this system ensures that it remains safe, secure, environmentally sound, and productive, particularly with regard to shared critical infrastructure that our nation relies on for national security, border security, and economic prosperity. Regulations are one tool by which the Coast Guard shapes the environment in which we operate and manages the risks in the marine transportation system. When we do regulate, we do so in response to congressional mandates, international obligations, and demand from industry and the public. And we are always mindful of the need to facilitate commerce, not impede it. Coast Guard regulations provide the certainty required to encourage investment in innovation and the level playing field needed to ensure fair competition and free market solutions. In addition, a unified federal regulatory regime adds consistency and reduces the burden that can be associated with multiple, often contradictory state regulations, particularly for a global industry like shipping. Coast Guard regulations are developed in full compliance with the Administrative Procedure Act and with all administration directives and executive orders. We work in close coordination with the regulated industry, science and academic communities, the interagency, the public, and our international counterparts to develop risk-based performance standards that provide the regulated industry flexibility in the development of their compliance strategies. The Coast Guard is unique among federal regulators because we operate in the environment we regulate. And we know firsthand how maritime operations are impacted by regulations. For this reason, the Coast Guard is focused on practical implementation and measured enforcement of regulations, particularly in the case of new regulatory regimes like the Subchapter M towing vessel inspection or the salvage and marine firefighting regulations that require both the regulated industry and the servicing industries to develop capacity and capability over time before full implementation can be achieved. This fully informed, common sense approach to the development and implementation of regulations enhances our ability to manage all risks in the increasingly complex, nationally vital marine transportation system. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your strong support of the Coast Guard and for the opportunity to testify today. I ask that my written statement be entered in the record, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Admiral Thomas. And we just figured out we have another panel that's going to be discussing oil spill and fire salvage issues, and we'd ask if you could stick around for that panel if you have time. We just asked Joanne behind you, Commander Burdian.
If Joanne says it's okay, sir, I'll...
Okay. Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Curry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd like to address several Shipping Act and Federal Maritime Commission issues of current interest. The FMC is a competition agency charged by Congress to prevent anti-competitive behavior by competitor collaborations in the international ocean liner industry and protect competition. This industry transports 65% of our nation's waterborne international imports and exports. We are also charged with the mission of ensuring that pro-competitive efficiencies and cost savings are obtained for U.S. consumers. On a broad scale, the Shipping Act provides full authority to the Commission to effectively carry out its mission. The competition standard used by the Commission to review carrier agreements is Section 6G of the Act. It is, in all relevant respects, the same standard used by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission when they review mergers, acquisitions, and competitor collaborations. Congress, however, specifically designed our competition standard to apply to the ocean transportation industry. As with DOJ and FTC, we assess industry concentration using the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. Collaborations that do not result in concentrated markets under HHI are unlikely to produce adverse competitive effects. Key elements in any antitrust analysis are ease of entry into a market, ease of exit from the market, and availability of competitors able to compete in the relevant market. Note, all antitrust laws, including the Shipping Act, protect competition, not individual competitors. The Act provides for public comment. Together with our competition analysis, the Commission considers the public's views in determining how to address anti-competitive concerns. The Prohibited Acts section of the Act mirror remedies found in other competition statutes. They provide the FMC with additional tools to address improper conduct such as price fixing, market allocation, unreasonable practices, discrimination in price or accommodation, refusals to deal, retaliation, boycotts, predatory practices, and discrimination based on shipper affiliation. The ocean liner industry has undergone consolidation. However, by the end of 2018, there will still be 13 major shipping lines operating in the international trades. The number of major carrier alliances serving the U.S. trades has decreased from 4 to 3. These two developments raise new issues and concerns for the FMC and have changed the way we approach carrier agreements. Broad authorities and language acceptable for a world with 20 or more carriers and more numerous but smaller alliances presented far fewer competitive concerns. With the increase in size and market share of alliances, the FMC has insisted on narrower agreement authorities and strict, clear, and definite agreement language. Importantly, we have strengthened the quarterly and monthly monitoring information requirements. Alliances do provide ocean carriers with operational flexibility, efficiencies, and opportunities for cost savings. In a capital-intensive industry, they facilitate the survival of independent companies, preserving industry competition and averting further industry concentration. Because of concerns about potential market power of larger alliances, the FMC carefully analyzes and examines agreements that request joint procurement authority. After that market analysis, if the market shares and indicators fall within generally accepted antitrust standards, then the FMC has no legal basis to request an injunction in federal court where we, the government, have the burden of proof. Note, please, all U.S. competition laws, including DOJ and FTC rules and the Shipping Act, allow for joint collaboration by competitors because they can benefit the end American consumer. To close, the Federal Maritime Commission, with its industry expertise and experience, is well positioned to understand the unique dynamics of the shipping industry and all of its stakeholders, to apply the competition laws fairly in this area, and to prevent anti-competitive behavior in these carrier agreements, all to ensure maximum benefits for the U.S. shipping public. Thank you for your attention. I ask that my written statement be entered into the record. Be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Be kind enough to ask those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. Without objection, it'll be entered into the record. I'm going to start. Chairman Young is not here. He's in a doctor's appointment, so I'm going to ask some questions on his behalf, things that he's interested in that deal with Alaska. So let's start with those, Admiral. For over 20 years in Alaska, the approved alternative planning criteria covered the entire Western Alaska captain of the port zone. Why did the Coast Guard approve alternative planning criteria for two entities covering only a portion of the Western Alaska captain of the port zone?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I know this is an important issue to Congressman Young, and he's been in contact with the Coast Guard and also with our district commander Rear Admiral Mike McAllister on this topic. The regulations provide for alternative planning criteria that will allow vessels transiting in certain portions of Alaska to meet the requirements by procuring services that are specific to their transit routes. And so the alternative criteria that have been approved by the Coast Guard are in full compliance with the regulations. And we're working hard with the congressman to seek additional solutions that will ensure coverage for the entire region.
Is it the Coast Guard's expectation that the equipment of all oil spill response organizations in Western Alaska will be available for any response in which an individual OSRO is responsible, as stated in Mr. Custer's testimony? Do you believe ORSOs, which are not responsible to respond, will provide such equipment despite their clear assertion that they are not, that they will not respond?
I absolutely believe that in the case of a spill, all equipment in the area will be available for the federal on-scene coordinator to leverage in response to that spill. And in fact, we've seen that in several recent cases in Alaska where we were able to bring to bear equipment from OSROs who were not the primary providers in order to mitigate a situation or in some cases prevent it from actually turning into a spill. So we absolutely believe that the increased response capability that the APCs in Alaska have brought to the region are a good thing, and the total price of coverage has decreased as a result.
Could you explain to me the difference between your oil spill response vessel and a firefighting response vessel, according to Coast Guard criteria?
Well, they're certainly very different capabilities. The oil spill response vessel typically brings the capability to recover floating oil from the water. Firefighting vessels would bring.
So they have a big boom
They have a number of different mechanical
to
recovery.
contain an oil spill?
Contain it sometimes to deliver dispersants or other means of mitigating oil on the surface of the water. The firefighting vessels bring the ability to put foam and water onto a fire. So there are different capabilities. Some vessels have both. Sir?
Some vessels do have both.
Yes, sir. Some vessels have both.
How many areas of the country cannot meet the national planning criteria for vessel response plans under the Oil Pollution Act?
Well, there are a number of areas of the country, mostly the remote areas, where we have approved alternative planning criteria specifically because the national planning criteria cannot be met. Alaska is one of them. Guam would be another one. But in mainland, the continental U.S., the national planning criteria is appropriate and can be met.
So you're saying, so for instance, you have it in the Gulf of Mexico, right? You don't have an alternative planning criteria that they can meet the actual criteria.
Yes, sir, particularly in the
Gulf.
Of Mexico.
But they can't in Alaska.
Yes, sir, that's right. They cannot in Alaska, mostly due to the expanse and the remoteness of the area.
So you issue waivers and give them the opportunity to have an alternative planning criteria in Alaska?
The regulation, again, and this is a perfect example of practical implementation of regulation, allows for the issuance of alternative criteria when the national planning criteria and the regulation cannot be met. And that is a means by which we can grow our national capacity to respond while still accommodating the needs of commerce.
Thank you. With that, I would yield to Mr. Garamundi. Or Mr. DeFazio, if Mr. Garamundi would like to yield.
The structure of the hearing brings Admiral Thomas back a couple of times, so I'm going to just move to some things that I think are not likely to be covered in the remaining of the hearing, and we'll come back to the other issues later. One thing that we've wrestled with here all the time I've been on this committee is the ballast water issue. It remains an issue. Currently, among the things that are of concern, just some questions for Admiral Thomas. Has the Coast Guard been able to devote the necessary personnel and resources to conduct effective oversight of the independent laboratories that are conducting the ballast water management systems type approval testing?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And as always, and I think our commandant's on the record that our nation needs more Coast Guard, and that extends to all of our responsibilities. We do conduct oversight at the independent labs. We do that in the process of first certifying them as an independent lab, and then in the course of their work, we visit them. No doubt, though, that particularly as the number of labs increase and the workload at those labs increase, our ability to provide the level of oversight that we would like to is challenged by our lack of resources.
Well, certainly, if the 14% cut actually goes through, that situation will get worse. But even at this stable funding level of today, you're not able to do the kind of oversight that you believe is necessary.
Our comment on is on record saying that the nation needs a Coast Guard that has about a 4% increase annually in our O&M funds and about a $2 million investment every year in our infrastructure. And that type of budget would allow us to rebuild readiness across all of our missions, sir, and fill the gaps, including the ones that you're pointing out with regard to our oversight of independent labs.
I didn't realize I'd given you an opportunity to advocate for your budget, but I think it just happened. Know that at least this member of this committee remains concerned about the quality of the oversight and the independent testing laboratories, and obviously the international standards. All of these things remain a concern. It's a concern I know in California from the various ports and water quality issues within those ports in the introduction of invasive species. An old issue that seems not to go away is a very old stern paddle wheel steamer called the Delta Queen. Where are you with regard to the issue of the exemption for the Delta Queen from the fire safety standards?
Congressman, thank you for that question as well. I'm aware of some work in Congress on legislation that would exempt Delta Queen from certain provisions, particularly structural fire protection provisions. The Coast Guard is not taking any action independent of providing advice on that particular legislation. However, we do not support an exemption for any vessel that would increase the risk, particularly of fire at sea.
So the Coast Guard remains opposed to exemptions from the fire safety standards for this vessel or any other vessel. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
Well, we'll undoubtedly be wrestling with that as that piece of legislation comes around. The backlog on regulations. I guess that goes back to the 14% proposed cut and the $2 billion additional dollars that you just requested. So have you received any new directives about the regulations from the Secretary of Homeland Security?
Well, Congressman, about the backlog, we're proud of the fact that we've reduced our regulatory backlog by over 40% since 2009, and we currently have about 60 rulemakings always working. Each of our authorization acts adds, on average, 5 rulemakings to that backlog. So we've been able to hold steady, make improvements, and hold steady. We are currently studying and working with the department on the impacts of the executive orders that have to do with regulations, and particularly with regard to the requirement to identify regulations to take off the books if additional ones go on. And we're receiving some guidance from the department and some from OMB as well. We haven't really finished our assessment of what that will mean for our regulatory program.
The 2-for-1 issue, the regulations that you are required to update really are not new regulations. They're updating existing regulations for the most part, as I look at those regulations. So you haven't yet figured out how to do the 2-for-1, 2 out, 1 in. So would it, in your opinion, given this point, given that executive order, how then would you update the remaining regulations that are before you? Where would you find 2 to eliminate as you update 1?
Sir, we're currently conducting a comprehensive review of all the regulations. There are certainly some regulations that are still on the books that are outdated. And the reason we haven't taken them off the books is because the effort required to do that really exceeds the benefits, because there's really no one impacted by those regulations.
I want to hone in on that. To get rid of a regulation it's the same process as establishing a regulation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And we are working hard to understand exactly how that process would work, and particularly how it would work in time with the process of putting additional regulations on the books.
And the other issue has to do with some 30,000 vessels that you are required to examine. I'm basically giving you an opportunity to make a pitch for that $2 billion. Would you like to comment on that piece of it and get it on the record as to what it takes to examine the 30,000 fishing vessels and the 5,000 commercial towing vessels?
Well, thank you for that opportunity, Congressman. We are challenged as our mission demands grow across the Coast Guard's mission set, and in addition with our marine safety mission. And we, as the Commandant has said, we need more Coast Guard. The Commandant has identified, growth in O&M and in our infrastructure investment, which will allow us to close our readiness gaps and meet the mission demands that Congress has put on us.
For the record, if you would please provide us with more detail on what it would take to carry out the specific responsibilities that you have on those inspections, the number of personnel, the amount of money it would take, and also the time frame of trying to move through those 30,000 vessels, given the present budget level.
Yes, sir. I'd be happy to provide that.
Thank you. For the record, thank you.
For the record.
I yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Yield to Mr. Rouser. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, with regard to salvage and marine firefighting, what is the Coast Guard's position on where the response industry is today with regard to providing response capabilities for salvage and marine firefighting incidents?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The congressional intent when the Coast Guard implemented the regulations, the salvage and marine firefighting regulations, was to build our national capacity and capability to respond to such incidents. Our view is that the regulation has succeeded in that regard. That said, there are certainly portions of the country where we have not yet reached the capacity that's intended by the regulation, and we're focused on ensuring that we continue to build capacity in those areas.
Is the Coast Guard aware of any incidents where a response vessel was not on scene within the required time frame for a vessel incident?
I believe there have been a few incidents, but the key to remember is that the standards and the regulations are planning factors, not performance factors. And they're often, very often, other things like weather, et cetera, maybe multiple incidents at one time, will make it impossible for the actual performance, on-scene performance, to match the planning factors that are required in the regulations. But we watch that very carefully, and when there is a significant mismatch between the capability that we expected to be available and that which is available, we'll do some work to determine why.
Have there been any incidents where a response vessel has refused to respond as required by contract? What would prevent them from responding? You touched on that slightly. And would this be a vessel of opportunity, or would this be when a vessel of opportunity would be called to respond?
Again, in an actual event, as opposed to when meeting their planning requirements, the responsible party is going to use whichever resources are immediately available and provide the services needed at the time. There may have been times, and I'm not aware personally of specific incidents, though the next panel may have some examples, where a resource or a vessel that's been identified in a plan is unable to respond as was originally thought would happen, and therefore has refused service, in which case a vessel of opportunity clearly can step in and take that responsibility.
For the sake of time, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. I would now like to yield to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to continue where we left off last time, Mr. Corey. The issuance of to the RoRo folks of authority to jointly negotiate with our marine service providers, who are specifically precluded under U.S. law from joining together to negotiate. So we're talking about, a conglomerate negotiating with individual service providers in the U.S. Apparently, your staff did an economic analysis, but the economic analysis has not been made available. Why not?
Thank you, Congressman. The Shipping Act statute under Section 6J specifically says that all of the information provided by filing parties and all of the information developed during the review process is, number one, confidential, and number two, is not subject to FOIA. When the commission is operating under this particular area and authority, we are essentially doing a law enforcement function, and it is the same type of rules that one would obtain. All of the information that was submitted in a normal situation at justice, for example, under Hart-Scott-Rodino would be equally.
I get, okay, if we could. So,
May I
no,
add
sir,
my-
wait, you've given me an excuse or a reason, but here's the point I want to make. You have the foreign entity joining together to negotiate singly with our service providers. Our service providers, how can you conclude that they aren't put at a disadvantage in these sorts of agreements? And what kind of analysis could you conduct that would say that's going to have confidential information? What did you get that was confidential from the RoRo providers? Did they tell you what rates they were going to bargain for? What did they give you that was confidential?
Yeah, if I could.
Well, just
finish.
what is confidential about the fact a conglomerate is now going to be authorized to negotiate singly with people who can't form a similar organization? Now, tell me what's confidential in there. You may be, you're going to cite the law and this and that, and oh, this is all confidential. Your staff did an analysis. The analysis was there would be no negative impact. And you're saying that we can't see that analysis. The people who are going to be negotiating, the foreign interests are somehow provided confidential information. What's the confidential information?
What I have offered to the members that I've met with and I offer to you today, Congressman, is, if I continue, under Section 6J, we can produce that information under a court order or if Congress requests it.
Okay.
And we would welcome, that was my final part, we
Okay,
would welcome
great.
a request from Congress.
I'm pretty sure he just requested it. So there you go. Congress just requested it. Go ahead.
So we would be happy to bring that before you in a confidential setting with you and your staff. Let us bring our economists with us to that meeting and lay out for you what we were looking at when we, and please understand, Congressman, it's a two-step process. It's the authority that was given to the RoRo group was not to enter into an agreement. They were allowed to go and begin a negotiation. And then any agreement, inchoate as it was, would be, has to then be brought back to the commission so we can complete a full economic analysis back and forth. So we are still at the front end. The RoRos have never even started to do a single negotiation. All we said was when we looked at all of the ports going around, it appeared that the market shares were sufficiently low to say, okay, let's let them go ahead and have the right to go talk, but not the right to contract. That's a second part that would have to still be done when they come back and let us look at very specific situations.
You're saying your commission has the authority to look at an individual contract between a maritime service provider, domestic, and the foreign entity, in this case, the RoRos, and that you could then say, no, that rate's too low, or somehow disallow it?
No, we do not regulate rates whatsoever.
Okay,
in
well,
any
then what would
shape,
you,
form, or
what
fashion.
would they bring back to you that you would review?
We would be looking at from a well-accepted antitrust standards of what are the market power of the purchasing entity, and in this case would be the RoRo agreement, what is their market share of the product being purchased, which is tug assist?
All right, well, the Justice Department, I've read, there's 2 letters from Justice expressing tremendous concern about this, but the Commission is saying we don't have a concern, or thus far we don't have a concern. Well, we might have a concern after we see what happens. I'm not quite following this, and I think, again, Mr. Chairman, my time's up, but I think this really points to the pressing need for Congress to consider some legislation in this
If
area.
you don't mind, keep going on this. I've actually got a question. You said you can't do anything, that they entered into negotiations, so what actions can you take after they make an agreement? What do you do after that? So you allow them to go into negotiations, right? Then you step back after you allow that. And what if they make an unlawful agreement? Meaning, what if their agreement as a consortium is unlawful? Then what can you do?
Then we would go into court with that evidence before a federal judge and seek an injunction saying.
Well, let's make this easier. How do you determine that they created an uncompetitive practice? How do you make that determination to even take them to court?
The standards have been gone over by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission.
Sure, but, all right, well, just tell us. How do you make that determination? You, the FMC. Otherwise, why do we have the FMC? Why not just have the Department of Justice and the FTC?
Well, I think perhaps let me, if I can, just go back to Congressman DeFazio's last statement to help fill in exactly what you're trying to get to, Mr. Chairman. The Department of Justice, in their letter that you referenced, Congressman, they began with a entering factual assumption that all of the alliances were the effective merger, and they say that they foreclose all competition amongst the alliances. And so they started with a factual situation that is simply not true. Each one of the alliances, we have careful monitoring information where there is very active price competition within each alliance, members within each alliance, and there is very active separate decision-making going on as to capacity coming in and out of all of those trades, both inside of the alliance and capacity by members outside of the alliance.
So you have, let's say 3 or 4 companies get together and form an alliance. You watch them and make sure that they don't talk amongst themselves on what they're going to charge the port or what they're going to try to get the port to agree to as they come in. You guys know that for a fact? These are foreign entities.
They file monthly and quarterly data on all of the revenue, on their boxes, on capacity coming in and out, and we are looking for, on an active basis, to see if there are parallel actions in the marketplace that would indicate what you just put at the end of your question. And what we continually find is there remains active competition on a pricing basis and on a capacity basis inside of each alliance. If we found that they began to have parallel activity, I can promise you, Mr. Chairman and Congressman DeFazio, that we would be in court as quick as we could with that evidence presented to a federal judge saying, sir, this alliance is now not operating the way it should.
Right,
we want an injunction and break it up.
Mr. Chairman, could you just yield back for a second? Because I just want to follow up on this point. When we're talking about one of these alliances, and again, I'm reading from the Justice Department letter, for example, 4 companies, 3 of which are ocean carriers slated to join the alliance, have pled guilty. 8 corporate executives have been indicted or pled guilty in connection with worldwide conspiracy involving price fixing, bid rigging, market allocation among providers of roll-on, roll-off cargo shipping. In addition, 3 companies, 6 individuals have pled guilty or been convicted at trial in connection with a price-fixing conspiracy among carriers of domestic freight between the continental U.S. and Puerto Rico. And that's not a problem? I mean, this went on. They, substantial fines were assessed. Was that initiated by FMC or by Justice?
There are two different actions in the issue.
Okay, so we have criminals, running these companies that are now getting limited antitrust immunity, and they are going to negotiate fairly with U.S. Marine service providers who have to individually negotiate with them, and these people aren't going to bring market clout and put our people at a disadvantage. I mean, this is just extraordinary. It defies common sense and also, history, since we get a bunch of criminals in these companies.
The Puerto Rico trades that you mentioned, Commissioner, those operated under trade lanes regulated by the Surface Transportation Board, not the Federal Maritime Commission. The second matter that you bring up, these were activities by some carriers that they were operating without an agreement. They did a separate, totally outside of the sight of any agreement. There was no agreement filed for which we could have monitored. So they were acting totally outside of any regulatory scope, and it was totally illegal, and they paid a heavy price for that.
But now some of them are in the alliance, and the same people are running the companies. I mean, that's who you're dealing with. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the time.
Thank the gentleman. Yield to Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Chairman, appreciate you both being here today. Admiral, the Coast Guard had issued a notice of proposed rulemaking for electronic TWIC readers at certain facilities that handle certain dangerous cargo, CDC. In the proposed rulemaking, there was a clear nexus between facilities and maritime access, where the TWIC electronic readers were going to be needed. As you began to move forward in the rulemaking, in your final rulemaking, you actually significantly expanded the scope of the electronic reader to include any facility that could be within a security site plan. And that was a fairly expansive change within the rulemaking that was not part of the original notice. Therefore, the Coast Guard didn't have the benefit of comments. I'm concerned about the lack of tieback to actual maritime in this case under the rule. The site security plan is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have a connection to maritime. A site could be anything. Folks could have a site security plan upon an entire facility, even though it could be walled off or prevented from having access to maritime. Can you give me a little bit of insight into why that expansion occurred during the rulemaking and why that wasn't part of the notice of proposed rulemaking to begin with?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I'm very familiar with that regulation and was involved in the development and implementation of the regulation all the way through, and I'm very confused by your question. When we published the notice of proposed rulemaking, the population of impacted facilities that are regulated under the Maritime Transportation Security Act was quite large. The final rule, it was narrowed significantly. And normally the question that I get is, how come that narrowing occurred? So I'm confused by your question. But in addition, the maritime...
Let me ask this. Did you remove the vessel interface requirement? Wasn't that the whole thing? Is that when you finalized the rule, you eliminated that vessel interface requirement?
Sir, again, at the risk of maybe not understanding your question, the Maritime Transportation Security Act allows the facility operator to define for the Coast Guard what is their regulated footprint in the facility. And so there is nothing about the TWIC reader rule that changed that. What the TWIC reader rule said was at the access points that you've defined in your approved security plan, you must have TWIC readers. And if they defined those access points beyond the facility ship interface place, then that's where because that's the assessment that they did, they were going to move their access points out, then that's where the readers need to go. But again, at the risk of maybe not understanding your question, there is nothing in between the proposed rule and the final rule.
I understand that the law relegates the scope to site security plans. I understand that. However, in the notice of proposed rulemaking, you limited the geographic scope to the vessel-to-facility interface area. In the final rulemaking, you no longer require that nexus or that interface. Therefore, the entire site security plan was within the scope. So that is a growth of scope. And my point is that site security plans for a company that may carry out various activities, that site security plan may be beyond the geographic scope of a vessel interface.
Right.
And so here's what my concern is. My concern is that companies may come back and start compartmentalizing site security plans, which I don't think is to the benefit of overall security, in an effort to not have to include electronic readers all over these huge facilities. Does that make sense?
Well, I would really like to offer you a brief on this topic, but I agree with you. There are a number of regulated facilities that have, by their own choice, extended the regulated perimeter beyond what is required by the law.
Okay,
But-
so we agree on that point. Do you agree that you removed the nexus for vessel-to-facility interface in your final rulemaking when that was in the notice of proposed rulemaking?
Sir, I don't want to disagree with you on that. I don't.
If I'm wrong, that's fine. Tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong, because that actually would sort of be very helpful in what I was going to ask you to do anyway.
I'm not clear enough that I understand what you're saying that I can tell you that you're right or wrong. But again, for me, this is
Oh,
totally.
come on, you were going down such a good path.
Well, that doesn't ring a bell to me that we removed the nexus. I think there's probably an interpretation issue in that the law says you need a nexus between the facility and you need to secure the area where you have that nexus between the facility and the ship. Many facilities, for a lot of different reasons, have extended the regulated area beyond that. When they do their risk assessment and they give us their plan, we approve the plan based on their assessment, and in some cases, they've extended the regulated perimeter way beyond what's required by the law.
Would you be willing to issue a clarifying statement that the rule applies to vessel-to-facility interface areas that handle CDC in bulk? Is that the intent?
I'll be certainly willing to make sure I understand the issue and then issue any clarifying statement that's required. But right now, sir, I'm really not understanding this issue well enough to make you any declarative promises.
Based upon the perhaps uncertainty here, and again, I'll totally open up, and maybe I'm not understanding this correctly, but based upon my read, I think that there was potentially a geographic expansion that occurred here that perhaps wasn't intentional. Would you be willing to, if we can determine that there is uncertainty here, would you be willing to grant a longer compliance period just so we can help to sort this out rather than requiring these facilities, many of which are in our district, to have to significantly change their reader profile?
Absolutely, sir. If there are unintentional consequences to the regulations that we certainly don't meet congressional intent, we are all about practical implementation of regulations.
Well, in addition to congressional intent, I think that something else that's really important to me, and I'm sure it is to you as well, is when you issue a notice of proposed rulemaking and you identify scope, if you're going to go outside that scope, then the Coast Guard's not going to have the benefit of the public input on that broader scope, and I think that's an important point to make as well.
I would agree, sir.
Oh, great.
But
Thank
this
you.
is-
Well, look, I want to make sure that we do schedule a follow-up meeting here and try and track this down and figure out what steps the Coast Guard should take moving forward if there is some uncertainty.
Happy to do that, Congressman.
Thanks, Admiral. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. If we seem combative today, we had the airline CEOs in yesterday, and there was a headline today that American Airlines cut their leg room in economy class more just to make the American people like them more, I guess. I now yield to their cutting leg room to make us happier.
There ought to be a law.
The airlines hate the American people. That's all I'm saying. I would yield to the gentleman from the LBC.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both Admiral Thomas and also Chairman Curry. And I do congratulate you. I know you're the acting chair or the interim chair, and my dear friend Mario Cordero is now the new chair or the new executive director of the great Port of Long Beach. I think it was an excellent choice, and I'm sure it was because of the great experiences that he had at the FMC. My first question, though, is for Admiral Thomas, and let's go back to my concerns about the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles, which really cover about 40% of the nation's containerized cargo. Now, we anticipate that cargo will increase over the next number of years. And so how is this going to, as the ports, as trade continues to increase, especially with greater mega ships coming in, how is this going to affect the Coast Guard? You already began, I think, talking about kind of stretched resources when you began. But as we see the growth in containerized trade continue, how will that impact the Coast Guard, and what additional resources to keep us safe do you think you'll need?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And certainly we've seen growth in the size of ships, but not just the size, the complexity of the systems that are used to move cargo through our ports more efficiently. And that is definitely a challenge for the Coast Guard, not just in LA and Long Beach, but around the nation. We definitely, and our commandant is on record as saying that we need to invest in our people and our workforce so that we can remain agile and keep up with the technology that is allowing our nation to enjoy the prosperity that we see through ports like LA. We need to invest in the enterprise-wide systems that we use for managing data and in an enterprise-wide system we use for managing our people. And we need to invest in the infrastructure that we currently use to service the marine industry, including the service we provide through our aids to navigation, but also that we provide at our National Maritime Center, where we credential mariners, and our National Vessel Documentation Center. So absolutely, the growth in demand through the ports translates directly to growth in demand for Coast Guard resources.
You know, we talk about national security and the need for national security, and we look at and we take great pride in our military, but for me, who represents the port areas, I cannot tell you how appreciative I am of the Coast Guard. I mean, I cannot overstate the importance of the Coast Guard to protecting our maritime interests and protecting our citizens is just unbelievable on the West Coast, and so we applaud you. Acting Chairman Curry, you know, you've talked a lot about how the increased consolidation is changing the work of the FMC. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more how you see the FMC changing. We've talked a little bit about the consolidation and some of those issues, but how do you see the work of the FMC changing with this tremendous consolidation that's going on?
I guess number one, in our Bureau of Trade Analysis, which is where all of our economists are housed, we've had a great staff, and they have been hiring some new, terrific transportation economists. It is a specialized area. The monitoring that I mentioned earlier has become, according to the carriers, much more intrusive, and so that is music to our ears. Not, you know, that's unfortunate, but for them. But we have been quite insistent on, no, we need more information on a much more regular and timely basis, so that we can take all of this and it's submitted to us confidentially per the statute. Then we match it up with an awful lot of commercially available information out there in the world liner industry. It is labor intensive for highly specialized people. And I would say that is the main area as we become more and more, I don't want to use the word concerned, because that would make it sound like we think something is going on. It's just that the potential for activity that would be prescribed by the Shipping Act or by other antitrust laws grows. So I think that's the best I can, you know, can respond to your question. If I look to the chairman and his experience, you always had one Marine standing on the wall. We now have two Marines. So that is, I think, the best answer I can provide for that, sir.
Thank you, and I'll wait, and I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, we're going to move to the second panel. I just got a quick question, Mr. Curry. How many times has the commission weighed in after an effective date of an agreement?
I'm sorry, say.
How many times has the FMC weighed in after an agreement has been made?
The way that actually works, and I have an example in my hand, I'll start with that. Should be no surprise that we've been in rather pleasant or otherwise conversations with filing counsel for the RoRo agreement and received a letter yesterday, and this is an agreement in effect as we speak today. I'm authorized to share the content of the letter, but not the letter itself. But I'm just going to say they have committed, willing to meet with the commission staff to discuss possible amendments to the agreement that might address concerns being expressed with respect to the authority. So we expect them to be in promptly to talk about amendments, and that is how the process actually works, Mr. Chairman, is if there's something going on, we bring them in. They don't want to go to court either, and that's how we obtain the constant update and amendments to all of these agreements. If I might say also, we will work with you and schedule. I'm not aware of any time we've had to actually go into court, but that's how the process works. We bring them in and say, this isn't working, we're going to change this.
Okay, so just for the record, the Federal Maritime Commission has never taken a consortium or anybody to court
May I
over anti-competitive practices.
May I consult my general counsel and his staff and get back to you with a written answer to
So
that?
to your knowledge, zero. To your knowledge at this
In
point.
7 years I've been there, no, but we've been administering the Shipping Act for 100 years, so I think it'd be foolish for me to make a categorical statement.
So
We will get back to you.
The problem here, which I think we're all trying to get at, is you're here to protect American companies and American interests. I mean, that's why you exist, right?
Absolutely.
That's why you're here. The law makes it so that you look more at the shippers, not the tugboats, and not the port or terminal operators. That's what you're looking at. So right now, you're not protecting the American interest because the only guys that are shipping are foreign entities that are basically ganging up and forming these little groups to where we have almost no competition whatsoever. You're not protecting the terminal operators because by law, it's not required, or the tug operators. So all the American companies, you're basically in your mind, as you follow the law and you quote law and cite law, there's no law making it so that you have to watch, you have to look out for the best interests of the American companies. Because the law says you look at shippers, and that's it. That's what you're looking out for. And I think that's where we're getting kind of tight around the axle here, is that that's kind of hard to swallow for us, is that you're not there for the American companies.
Mr. Chairman, I believe a more, on one side, broad and perhaps more correct statement is we, like any other federal competition agency, look to protect competition, and within that, not competitors in any one area, because at the end of the day, if full competition is at work in the marketplace, the end of that process is the American consumer. The American consumer is the one who benefits with lower prices in their goods. The American exporter who has more reliable and the least expensive as available transportation for their export goods into international markets. So I would, with all respect, say we are not singularly focused on shippers in that regard. So.
Thank you, gentlemen. Admiral Thomas, if you'll stick around, we're going to add a microphone and get on to panel 2. Mr. Corey, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Corey, do you mind sticking around too? We're just going to, we're going to throw the staff into a tizzy, but do you mind sticking around? Do you have time?
I planned on staying to listen, so be happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Keep your seat.
Admiral Thomas, you can just stay where you are if you want to. Oh, they're moving you over. Okay. Okay, I think we're all together. And if I could ask too, as we want to get through this, obviously this is a giant panel now because we combined 3 into 2. I guess we could have had you all there in the first place, but that enabled us to focus on a couple of things in that one, and now we'll go into this one. So if you could keep your remarks brief, we can submit them for the record, and we'll start just talking back and forth. I thank the first panel for being with us today, and you're still here, and the second panel. The witnesses for the second panel are Mr. Todd Schauer, President of the American Salvage Association, Mr. Stephen Candito, current board member and former president and chief executive officer with the National Response Corporation, Mr. Nicholas Nuddo, chief executive officer of Rapid Ocean Response Corporation, Mr. Norman Buddy Custard, president and chief executive officer of the Alaska Maritime Prevention and Response Network, Mr. Tom Allegretti, president and chief executive officer for American Waterways Operators, and Mr. John W. Butler, president and chief executive officer for the World Shipping Council. Mr. Schauer, you're recognized for your statement.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. I represent the American Salvage Association, known as the ASA. The ASA represents 90% of the U.S. salvage capability. We appreciate the chance to give an overview of the salvage industry and to discuss current issues. In the interest of time, my submitted statement has been abbreviated. Salvers are not ship scrappers. We are emergency responders and problem solvers for the shipping industry. Beyond search and rescue, the Coast Guard does not have the assets to perform salvage operations, such as rescue towing, firefighting, or other salvage services. Simply put, salvers respond to any casualty, anywhere, at any time. This may include collisions, fires, explosions, or groundings, may involve tankers, cruise ships, LNG carriers, offshore rigs, or any other vessel type. This statement of commitment may be hard to believe, but it's quite true. Salvers are extremely resourceful and dedicated. Most of the companies are family-owned, multi-generational businesses. Salvers operate in the most difficult conditions on the planet. Some jobs are incredible feats of engineering. Most of you probably recall the Costa Concordia job led by an ASA member in Italy. Others are courageous acts of seamanship, such as rescuing a disabled tanker in heavy weather. A member did this just this past weekend off of Galveston. Our members are the special forces of the marine industry, maritime response. The ASA has a good working relationship with the Coast Guard. Our operations teams respond together, and we interact often on regulatory matters. While we have our disagreements, we respect the capabilities and common sense nature of the U.S. Coast Guard. Salvors are the first line of defense in preventing marine pollution. Our objective is to keep the oil in the ship and out of the water. Plugging a hull breach, lightering fuel from a stricken vessel, or simply saving the ship from sinking is much more effective than skimming spilled oil. Regarding shipboard firefighting, the salvor has the requisite experience and equipment. We work alongside municipal fire teams, and we take the lead for all offshore fires. Salvors will clear all blocked waterways to restore commerce, whether caused by an accident or, God forbid, a terrorist attack. The U.S. Navy's global salvage capability depends on response contracts with ASA members. Due to the leadership of this subcommittee, the SMFF regulations were promulgated in 2008 for tankers, 2013 for non-tankers. The result was extremely positive. The salvors rapidly organized, we expanded equipment inventories, and developed robust networks to comply. Now, some third parties have recently questioned the commitment and resources of the SMF providers. Let me be very clear. We will always respond. Our livelihoods depend on salvage job income, and our Coast Guard approved and pre-agreed contracts with the ship owners will prevent any delays. Now, providers rely heavily on subcontracted resources. Our networks are comprised of major fleets of tugs and barges, derrick barges, all variety of support vessels and marine services. We also have agreements with municipalities. For example, the New York City Fire Department has pre-agreed to support us during a vessel fire. This system of combining salvor-owned specialized assets with extensive resource networks has proven effective in more than 180 responses since the inception of the regulations. Provider capability and compliance is verified by many layers of oversight. These include drills and exercises, 2 separate Coast Guard verification programs, owner and insurer vetting, and direct approval of all actual operations by the Coast Guard. At the crux of the issue are non-dedicated resources. Unlike spill response, the diversity of the 19 salvage services demands large networks of vessels of opportunity. There's no two ways to look at it. Providers rely heavily on this system. It includes more than 7,300 support vessels alone. We also utilize existing U.S. air, sea, and ground logistics modes, arguably the most developed in the world. Duplicating all of these resources of opportunity with dedicated assets would be highly impractical and overwhelmingly costly. In closing, salvors will continue to respond quickly, grow capacity, and comply with all required verifications. The Vessel of Opportunity system works. Any attempt to duplicate it will place undue financial burden on the shipping industry and the consumer. Thank you, and I request that my statement be submitted.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Candido.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi. I am Stephen Candido, former CEO of National Response Corporation, one of the founders of One Call Alaska, along with Resolve Marine Group. NRC and Resolve are leading oil spill removal organizations and salvage and marine firefighting providers in the United States. Joining me today are leadership from Resolve, NRC, and senior members of One Call Alaska, the true local response experts. They represent the core One Call Alaska, an emergency response organization with the commitment and capability to prepare for and respond to marine casualties in Western Alaska. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to address response plans under the alternate planning criteria for Western Alaska. I respectfully disagree with the need for Section 107 of H.R. 5978. It would stifle competition and hinder improvement of oil spill response in Alaska. I will address the inaccurate arguments advanced by organizations that support Section 7. They claim reducing competition is necessary and that a monopoly will better serve Alaska's interests. Specifically, Section 107 prevents achieving a key goal of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 to provide robust oil spill response capability along all U.S. coasts. Under the Coast Guard's implementation of APC, the response industry is improving coverage, investing in vessels, aircraft, and staging facilities, and hiring experienced manpower, most of which is based in Alaska. Section 107 sets back progress made by One Call Alaska, discouraging further investment needed to move Alaska closer to the higher OPA standards in the lower 48. The Exxon Valdez exposed how ill-prepared the U.S. government and the maritime industry were to respond to major spills, particularly in Alaska. there were very limited ability to respond to large open water spills. OPA jump-started the massive investment in private sector national response industry with 4 key provisions. First, clarifying chain of command and responsibilities under the National Contingency Plan. Second, directing private sector to provide the response equipment and manpower. Third, incentivizing private OSRO investment by requiring vessel and oil facilities to contract with OSROs with capacity to meet the requirements. And finally, encouraging OSRO investment through responder immunity. The Coast Guard has provided the necessary flexibility and competitive environment to accommodate challenges in complying with OPA's standards in Western Alaska while driving improvements in coverage. Section 107 type legislation impedes expansion of resources by excluding competition from the very companies with the most experience and the largest inventory of assets already in Alaska. Such legislation is premised on false assertions. 1, competition will drive up fuel prices. 2, there will be a price war ultimately ending in an unsustainable price of 0. And 3, competitors provide duplicative resources driving up costs. I will address each of these contentions separately, but as a general matter, competition ultimately drives down prices while increasing resources. The fallacy is that a nonprofit monopoly provides the most resources at the lowest cost. With regard to fuel prices, our written testimony includes a fuel price report by Alaska's Department of Commerce published in January 2017, reviewing the previous year. This report concluded heating fuel and gasoline prices in most regions of the state are at their lowest since early in 2009, and most surveyed communities have seen significant declines. With regard to remote communities, the report noted remote communities have higher shipping costs, resulting in fuel prices that are significantly higher than the statewide average. However, since most communities receive at least 1 fuel delivery a year, they are continuing to benefit from the lower cost of fuel. Thus, the primary fuel cost drivers are the price per barrel, the fixed cost per shipment, and infrequency of delivery, rather than any minimal APC market pressure. Secondly, I can affirm One Call Alaska has not participated in a price war. Our pricing is dependent on our cost of operations and number of customers. That scale has largely remained steady as of now, and we are the most expensive provider. In actuality, it is the nonprofit which consistently undercuts our prices, seeking to compete, which they should not be doing given their nonprofit status. Finally, with regard to the assertion multiple providers duplicate resources, I note the significant number of resources we included and specific investments in Alaska. Simply put, the main reason an APC is needed is that currently the resources are insufficient to meet OPA standards. Thus, competition has caused us to add personnel, equipment. Further, the resources we added are not the same type that existed. Since inception, One Call Alaska represents a $44 million investment in aircraft, equipment, vessels, and facilities. Resolve and NRC also employ full-time more than 100 Alaskans. Further, over the last year alone, we cooperated with the Coast Guard to save 100-plus lives and prevent the discharge of millions of gallons of oils. Importantly, most of the casualties we responded to were not customers of our APC. In fact, our services were called upon out of the necessity as of the entities advocating could not effectively respond to our customer spill. In closing, just One Call Alaska is proud to announce plans to expand the entire Western Alaska CO2P, whether it's a stricken 4.2 million gallon tanker, a disabled fishing vessel from Dillingham with 100 souls on board, or flying aircraft. One Call Alaska endeavors to prevent, prepare for, and respond to marine casualties in Western Alaska. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nudo, and I'm saying that right, correct?
Nadeau, that's close.
Nudo, okay, recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamundi, and members of the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify and provide information on the gap between marine salvage and firefighting requirements and the actual services contracted for by vessel owners. The gap places the marine environment and vessel crews in considerable jeopardy. My name is Nicholas Nadeau. I'm the CEO of Rapid Ocean Response Corporation. Rapid Ocean Response provides high-speed, dedicated vessels for offshore firefighters and surveyors as required pursuant to the Salvage and Marine Firefighting Regulations. The Salvage and Marine Firefighting Regulations I derived from the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. That statute reads in relevant part that tank vessels identify and ensure by contract or other means the availability of private personnel and equipment necessary to remove a worst-case discharge, including a discharge resulting from fire or explosion. The clear import of that provision is that Congress intended that when a fire or similar incident occurs offshore, marine salvage and firefighting resources be identifiable and insured by contract to be available to respond. As my testimony will explain, neither of those requirements are currently being met. In terms of the implementation of the Salvage and Marine Firefighting Regulations, the Coast Guard was surprisingly patient. over a period of 23 years, the effective date of the regulations was repeatedly pushed back. The reason the Coast Guard usually provided for the delay was that more time would be needed to allow the resource providers to build the vessels necessary to achieve compliance with the rules. Unfortunately, the dedicated network the Coast Guard envisioned has not been established. Looking at the salvage and marine firefighting regulatory requirements, it's clear that these requirements cannot be met consistently without a dedicated network. The regulations require, quote, a plan holder must ensure by contract or other approved means that the response resources are available to respond. Instead of building the dedicated resources the regulations required, the regulated community attempted to achieve compliance using a vessel of opportunity approach. This strategy, a vessel owner lists numerous vessels in its vessel response plans in the hopes that one might be available to respond. This approach is both legally and operationally deficient. Legally, four of the qualified resource providers, of the four qualified resource providers, three condition their response on the availability of their vessels. All resource providers rely heavily upon subcontractors whose contracts provide they will respond if available. Operationally, the vessel opportunity approach also cannot achieve compliance consistently. Because non-dedicated vessels are often engaged in other work, they must first disengage and return to port. There, these vessels load the necessary equipment and personnel and are retrofitted with firefighting pumps. It's unlikely these activities can be accomplished and mount a compliant response within the 6, 12, or 18-hour time frames. The obvious question is, how could these serious deficiencies not have come to the attention of the Coast Guard? The salvage and marine firefighting regulations provide a very specific list of mandatory exercises and drills. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard has not required vessel owners to provide proof of these exercises. There are real-life examples of these compliance issues. On March 14, 2015, the Gray Shark lost power off the coast of New Jersey. On the 15th, a fire broke out. On the 17th, she arranged to tow back to New York Harbor, where the New York Fire Department put the fire out on the 18th. During that time, the Gray Shark utilized a vessel of opportunity approach to compliance. She contacted over 200 vessels. None were available to respond. The Caribbean Fantasy, a cruise ship, caught fire within 2 miles of the entrance to San Juan Harbor. Although a very successful evacuation was performed, according to Coast Guard Commander Janet Espino Young, the active firefighting component of the vessel response did not meet the criteria as required by the regulations. That's within 2 miles of a major port. In 2015, RORC submitted an application to build a nationwide dedicated salvage and marine firefighting response network. That network, comprised mainly of harbor pilot groups, utilizes high-speed ocean-going pilot boats to transport fire teams and surveyors. These pilot boats were to be used until custom-built fire boats could be placed in service. RORC provided examples of lack of compliance and operational deficiencies in each captain of the port zone. On March 14th, the Coast Guard responded, explaining that the Coast Guard could not approve RORC's application without first determining that a gap in compliance existed. On March 17th, 2016, Admiral Peter Brown announced a verification process to determine whether gaps in compliance did exist. Inexplicably, this process has not come to fruition. In closing, the congressional mandate that salvage and marine firefighting resources be identifiable and ensured by contract to be available to respond has not been achieved. I ask the Oversight Committee to press the Coast Guard to reject vessel response plans that do not provide evidence of the required drills and exercises. Without requiring proof of compliance, Congress's clear intentions will remain unfulfilled. Thank you, and I ask that my written statement be adopted to the record.
Without objection. This is interesting, too, because Mr. Schauer and Mr. Nadeau are talking about the same issues. Mr. Candido and Mr. Custer can be talking about the same issue on different sides. So, Mr. Custer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. The Alaska Maritime Prevention and Response Network, a nonprofit organization, administers the only Coast Guard-approved non-tank vessel APC program that covers the entire Western Alaska Captain of Port Zone. The network supports over 450 maritime companies from around the globe operating in and transiting through Western Alaska. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the implementation of alternative planning criteria in Western Alaska. By way of background, the area referred to as Western Alaska has long been of interest to the U.S. Congress. As the committee knows, Western Alaska includes the U.S. Arctic region and other areas of critical national interest in Western Alaska, including unique environment and critical habitat, the largest and most valuable commercial fishing industry in the United States, and unique cultural interests. In short, Congress has a long and valued history in recognizing and addressing the many challenging issues that are unique to this area for the benefit of all Americans. As an Alaskan, I very much appreciate Congress's efforts in that regard. The Western Alaska Captain Port Zone comprises over 1 million square miles of ocean. Because this exceptionally large area has little infrastructure, the national planning criteria used to meet the requirements of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 in the continental United States have been very difficult and challenging to obtain there. Instead, vessel owners and operators have been using alternative planning criteria, or APC. The network has concerns on several major issues. The Coast Guard has deviated from the long-standing practice of managing the Vessel Response Plan regulation of Western Alaska on a captain-to-port-wide basis, creating confusion among the maritime industry and undermining the ability to sustain and enhance oil spill preparedness in Western Alaska. The current management practice, as the proposed guidance by the Coast Guard, will, over time, continue to lower response capability and capacity. They will weaken the oil spill safety net in Western Alaska, undermining environmental protection and putting the livelihood of fishing vessels in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and California in jeopardy. The Coast Guard recently imposed competition on APC providers in Western Alaska, but the terms are not clear, equitable, or consistently enforced. All APC providers should cover the entire captain port zone and should position and build out, not minimize, equipment within Alaska so that resources are readily available rather than being a continent away, taking days to deliver and putting in place. By then, the damage from the spill is done. There has been no objective economic analysis completed by the Coast Guard. The independent economic assessment we provided to the Coast Guard validates the downward trend we are witnessing in sustaining response capabilities in Western Alaska. We are now witnessing a decline in greater intensity and velocity than predicted by that study. The claim that there is more equipment in Western Alaska with multiple APC providers is mischaracterization of reality because it assumes all APC providers make their equipment available for any vessel during a response. But the only equipment a plan holder can rely on is what is available for their own individual APC provider. As Congress examines a path forward and to the extent that changes are made to the way APC is implemented in Alaska, we request that the following principles be considered. APC providers must cover the entire Western Alaska captain-to-port zone. Continued fragmentation of the captain-to-port zone would continue to result in reduced capacity to protect Western Alaska and the Arctic. Reduce the risk of oil spills must be an essential component of an APC program. The economic ramifications of how the Coast Guard is implementing APC in Western Alaska must be analyzed and understood. Accountability is paramount. When an oil spill happens, Alaskans want assurance that vessels in an APC program have the resources in Alaska readily available to respond to a spill. Unlike now, the Coast Guard must be able to consistently apply and enforce whatever rules it develops. Waivers should be the exception, not the rule. Regular order must be adhered to in regulating industry. Regulations by administrative policy allow the Coast Guard to change the rules without notice or an opportunity for comment and without analyzing the economic impact. Up until recently, the Coast Guard managed oil spill prevention and response on a captain-port-wide base in Western Alaska. The result was a long-term sustainable build-out of response resources for the benefit of the entire region. Congress should provide policy directives that result in continuity and predictability and resolve the ambiguities in the regulations that allow the Coast Guard to unilaterally depart from the successful approach and direct the Coast Guard to return to an area-wide APC requirement in Western Alaska and the Arctic. These principles are offered to restore order to the process of regulating the maritime industry in Western Alaska. More importantly, they will ensure that oil spill response is administered in a fair and balanced manner and will ensure that a robust and sustainable oil spill prevention response program protects all of Western Alaska, including the U.S. Arctic region. The network stands ready to work with the committee, the Coast Guard, and all stakeholders to craft a long-term solution that works for Western Alaska. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the subcommittee's examination of this important issue. I ask my written remarks be entered into the record. Thank you.
Without objection, thank you. Mr. Allegretti, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding the hearing today. I'm here to ask for your assistance in averting an existential threat to the health and the viability of AWO members in the shipdocking business. Over the past year, international ocean carrier alliances have filed agreements 5 times with the Federal Maritime Commission seeking authorization to negotiate collectively with tugboat operators and other domestic service providers who have no counterbalancing ability to take such action under U.S. antitrust laws. In 3 of the cases, The parties to the agreement eventually withdrew the collective negotiation provision. But in January, a group of foreign car carriers filed an amendment that allows alliance members to negotiate jointly with American tugboat operators. Over AWO's objections and without a thorough analysis of the injurious impact on the tugboat industry, the FMC allowed the amendment to take effect. AWO believes that both the letter of the Shipping Act and congressional intent in enacting that statute prohibit collective negotiation of rates with domestic service providers. We foresee an egregious competitive imbalance and grave harm to American companies if foreign ocean carrier alliances are allowed to negotiate collectively with U.S. tugboat operators. We have laid out the legal and the practical reasons for our concerns in multiple submissions to the FMC and in meeting with FMC commissioners and staff. We are gratified that both the Department of Justice and the bipartisan leadership of this subcommittee and the full committee have voiced similar concerns to the FMC. But frankly, we're astonished that a majority of the FMC commissioners do not share them. Because the FMC allowed the car carrier group to collectively negotiate with U.S. companies, we were not surprised when in March a group of Japanese ocean carriers filed yet another agreement that would authorize the parties to negotiate collectively with tugboats. The FMC had signaled a green light for this provision. AWO and other service providers have registered strong opposition, but the offending provision was never removed from the agreement. This series of events leads us to three basic conclusions, all of which are very troubling to us. First, that foreign ocean carriers of ever greater size and market power will continue to seek authority to negotiate collectively with American tugboat operators who enjoy no ability under the antitrust laws to take similar action. Second, that the FMC is either unwilling or unable to halt and reverse this unfair and anti-competitive situation. And third, that the FMC intends to extend its regulatory review over the tugboat industry, an authority Congress has not conferred. In the process, it will eviscerate the confidentiality of our commercial contracts with our customers. My central message to you is this: it is fundamentally unfair, anti-competitive, and detrimental to the U.S. maritime industry to skew the playing field in favor of massive international shipping conglomerates, which include foreign, state-owned enterprises and entities that have paid criminal fines for anti-competitive behavior at the expense of American tugboat companies. If the FMC lacks the will or the ability to act swiftly and decisively to stop and reverse this growing trend, then AWO members call upon Congress to amend the Shipping Act to unequivocally prohibit joint negotiation with domestic service providers. It is unconscionable to us that an agency of the U.S. government would sanction the disadvantaging of an essential American industry in favor of foreign shipping alliances. Congress should act to rectify this injustice where the FMC has failed to do so. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Allegretti. Mr. Butler, you're recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, members of the subcommittee, my name is John Butler. I'm the President and CEO of the World Shipping Council. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I have submitted written testimony that I would ask be included in the record. I'd like to make 2 points about the liner shipping industry, and then I would like to address the issue of joint purchasing. The first point is that the liner shipping industry is a critical link in our nation's international trade, and it is a major driver of the economic vitality of this country. Whether our members are carrying consumer goods to retailers in the United States, supplying parts to automobile manufacturers, or carrying U.S. agricultural goods to foreign markets, liner shipping touches almost every part of the U.S. economy. The second important point about liner shipping is that the industry is in a period of substantial change. The market for international containerized shipping services is intensely competitive. The result of that competition has been historically low ocean transportation rates for U.S. importers and exporters almost continuously since the global recession in 2008. Persistent low freight rates have caused carriers to seek efficiencies in every part of their operations, and that includes tremendous investments in a new generation of highly fuel-efficient container ships. There have also been structural changes. A number of carrier mergers closed last year, and we'll see several more that are likely to be completed this year. However, even after those mergers are completed, the liner shipping market will remain unconcentrated. As the committee's discussed already, vessel sharing agreements or alliances are one of the tools that carriers use to make sure they get the best operational efficiency out of their vessel fleets. Sharing vessels allows carriers to serve more ports worldwide, which improves choices for shipper customers and increases competition. All carrier agreements must be filed with the Federal Maritime Commission, and the Commission may seek changes to carrier agreements based on concerns that the Commission may have, as well as concerns that may be raised by the public and interested parties. As Mr. Allegretti referred to, in the case of the 3 major alliance agreements, for example, tug operators raised concerns about the authority of ocean carriers to jointly negotiate for tug services. And the carriers in those 3 agreements changed the language to clearly state that there would be no joint negotiation for tug services in the United States. The staff summary for this hearing mentions 2 carrier agreements that contain some joint purchasing authority. The Commission just yesterday has decided that it does not have jurisdiction over one of those agreements. The only remaining agreement in question with general joint purchasing authority requires the parties to go back to the FMC before they take any actual concrete action under that authority. That means nothing happens under that agreement until the FMC gets another look at it and the public has an opportunity to comment. It's unclear at this stage whether and to what extent carriers in the future may wish to pursue joint purchasing of services and vessel supplies in the United States. What is clear is that any agreements with that authority will be subject to strict scrutiny. That is in line with the full committee's recent instructions to the FMC, and it's consistent with the FMC's actions to date. I think the message has been received on the carrier end as well. The one thing that I would respectfully ask of the subcommittee, of the FMC, and of service providers is not to take a categorical view about joint purchasing. The Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Transportation, and the Supreme Court have all said that joint purchasing can be pro-competitive, and whether in a given situation those activities should be allowed or they should be challenged depends on the specifics of that particular situation. As the shipping industry works through the current economic and operational challenges, there may be need for different types of business arrangements, including joint purchasing. And some of those activities may be beneficial both to service providers and to service buyers. Let's not foreclose potentially useful tools without first making sure that we understand how those tools might operate in the market. I thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to yield to Mr. Larson over there. I don't think he got a question during the first panel. If you have a question, please.
Sure. This question is really with regards to this the firefighting issue, and I was wondering if for Admiral Thomas, if the regulations, the SMFF regulations, delineate a list of exercises and drills that vessel owners are required to conduct, are those vessel operators conducting those required drills?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, the regulations do specify, as was testified to, a number of different verification processes, including exercises and drills. The Coast Guard has limited resources to oversee all of those, but we do oversee the ones that we can. I think this is really a question about our capacity to verify compliance with the SMFF regulations. And as I testified to in the earlier panel, we are limited in our capacity across our Coast Guard. But we do have a robust verification currently underway. That the verification process itself, sir, is limited by some legal requirements in terms of how much information we can ask for from regulated entities. So we're conducting that verification in the course of required plan renewals.
So what kind of legal requirements are there if in fact the law says that you are supposed to verify that these drills are taking place?
Well, sir, so we, for example, we can attend and oversee the drills that are required by the law. But what we're limited is our ability to ask for additional information that we might use for verification outside of the normal cycle in which a regulated entity would normally be providing that information to the Coast Guard. I think a key thing to understand here is that these regulations do not regulate anybody at this table, at least not the four gentlemen to my left. They regulate vessel operators, and those operators are compelled to comply with the regulations by procuring services from the likes of the gentleman to my left. And that's, I think, really one of the fundamental issues here.
Much like the Osro model.
Much like the Osro model, the salvage business model developed differently for a lot of reasons that Mr. Schauer touched on, but it's very similar in terms of the legal and regulatory construct.
Okay. Is it NIDO? NIDO?
Nadeau, thank you.
Nadeau, sorry. All right. You said that earlier. Thank you. What would a successful verification process look like in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a comprehensive and robust verification process for the response resources that we address would simply identify a vessel crossing within the 50-mile barrier, falling within the jurisdiction of salvage marine firefighting, and asking that vessel where its response resources are, and then determining whether they have contracts with those resources which require them to respond. If the contract provides that they'll respond if they're available, it does not meet the legal requirements. If the vessels are 600 nautical miles away or not in the captain of the port zone, it does not meet those requirements operationally. We provided evidence of that to the Coast Guard in 2015 with our application for an alternative planning criteria, evidence of the operational legal deficiencies in every captain of the port zone, and they responded saying they would do a robust verification to determine if, in fact, those deficiencies were apparent. That has not come to fruition. Admiral Thomas, by the way, is a man of unquestioned integrity and tremendous leadership, and we have great respect for him. However, this program has not been reporting to him, so I do not believe he's as knowledgeable about the lack of verification. And his response to your question about whether they're conducting or requiring the mandatory drills and exercises, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of one shipping company that's required to provide those.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I think we need to explore that a little further, but I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I continue to have concerns about some of the vessel response that's been discussed today. For example, I'm concerned about the timing it's going to take for these vessels to get to some of the potential accidents that occur. Representing South Louisiana, had the chance to spend a good bit of time on Deepwater Horizon activities, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. And I'm curious about how a tug that's traveling at 10 knots is going to have the capability to get out there in any reasonable period of time to provide the response time that we need in a disaster. Admiral, you care to comment on that?
Thank you, Congressman. The performance requirements or planning requirements are delineated in the regulations in the national planning criteria. And they do specify response times that are required. The process of determining those times was subject to robust analysis and comment through the rulemaking process. I think one of the real keys here, and I'd like to take this opportunity to correct, the law, and therefore the regulation, never envisioned dedicated resources. It's not required. And in the course of the regulatory analysis, and most importantly, the economic analysis.
I just want to make sure I heard, you said it never required dedicated resources, is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That's what I said. And in fact, the economic analysis, which, as you know, is required for every rulemaking, we would not have been able to support a cost-benefit analysis had we required dedicated under contract resources. And so the planning factors say identify and procure in one way or another, make an arrangement with resources that can meet these planning factors. But as I explained earlier, those are not performance factors when it comes to an actual response. So there's a misunderstanding in terms, in other words, if the Coast Guard were to require dedicated resources for this purpose, the law would have to be very specific so that our regulation could be equally prescriptive.
If I could address this is a common misunderstanding, I believe. If I'm
Sure,
out of order.
just quickly, I've got some other questions.
I think as to the non-dedicated resource question, it appears in the Federal Register at page 80634, volume 73, number 251. One commentator suggested that the use of non-dedicated resources is a viable and commercially acceptable, cost-effective way of conducting emergency response business, and therefore should be utilized to establish appropriate salvage and marine firefighting standards. The Coast Guard disagrees. The rulemaking is designed to mirror the success of OSROs and plan holders with prearranged contracts that required 33 CFR 155. This will ensure both the industry and resource providers are clearly aware of who will respond on the scene and at what time frame they are capable of arriving.
We got a fight in our hands now.
I also would like to address the planning standards, if I could. It was referenced by Admiral Thomas. The regulation is very specific. It provides that, in this instance, compliance with the regulation, I'm quoting from 155.4010C, compliance with the regulations is based upon whether a covered response plan ensures that adequate resources are available, not upon whether the actual performance of these response resources after an incident meets the specified arrival times. The availability requirement that you have a contract with resources that are available and ensures that by contract is the legal requirement. It's true that planning standards don't kick in. Compliance is determined on whether you have a contract that ensures the resources are available. Thank you.
Should we let the two folks in the middle move out of the way and let y'all fight?
Yeah.
Would that be better? All right. Wait, let me go back to, I do want to hear your comments, but I want to make sure I understand something that you commented on, Admiral. You said that under a cost-benefit analysis, you determined that a dedicated vessel was not appropriate. Is that what we learned about last week, this Paperwork Reduction Act consideration that occurred that we recently, again, just learned about last week? Is that what you're referring to?
No, sir, I don't believe so. I think that particular act is what is making it more difficult for us to conduct the verification on the timeline that we would like to do. So we are really forced to do the verification on a timeline that's in sync with the normal industry requirement to renew their plans with us. Remember, the regulated entity here is the vessel operator. It's
Sure.
none of these service providers.
When did that termination occur on the verification? That when, as I understand from last week, we were briefed that it was based upon the Paperwork Reduction Act.
When did it occur, sir?
Yes. When did that termination of verification occur?
Well, we have not terminated the verification. We've just adjusted the timeline on which we can reasonably expect to get a good enough representational data set to make a determination on whether or not the APC that's been requested is justified.
Okay.
We are still actively verifying.
Okay, so then so it is being enforced, but you said the timeline is the issue right now.
Yes, sir. So we will conduct verification in the course of plan renewal that's required already by the regulation, as opposed to going out to the plan holders in between the renewal process and asking for additional information.
Okay, so your compliance process is what again then?
Yeah, it's as similar to what was described, but essentially we'll take a vessel's plan and we'll impose a scenario on it, and we'll freeze in time where that vessel is when it occurs and where all the response resources are, and see how well they can meet the planning standards.
Please, very briefly, we're
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Just to extend the logic of Mr. Nadeau here, if we extend this logic throughout the system that we use, salvage and marine firefighting, every 200 miles on the coast, you would have a large ocean tugboat, dedicated, not able to do anything else, a derrick barge, you'd have supply boats, crew boats, firefighting vessels, you'd have air charter cargo aircraft, dedicated cargo aircraft parked because those can't be of opportunity either. You'd have trucks parked, you'd have basically all of the services we provide are provided via existing networks. So if you're going to say they ought to be dedicated, then throw all that out and let's build a new system. It's sort of ridiculous when you look at the cost of it. So now we're common sense folks. We think the Coast Guard is. There's layers. There's regions where probably less redundancy. There's places where there's a lot. In fact, the Gulf of Mexico, it's a resource-rich environment down there. We get a response there where it's easy. Okay, other places have less. So it is a process we have to go through, and we have to look at the areas of the need the most focus and continue to grow capacity. Our industry has been growing capacity since our inception, so we have no problem doing that.
I want to caution you in using the term ridiculous when we're talking about this here, because we are potentially talking about lives, and response time and capabilities are very important because potentially we have lives at risk. And I want to remind you, Deepwater Horizon, we lost 11 people, the biggest part of that tragedy. Can you go back, just one thing that you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the New York Fire Department being part of your response capabilities. How does that work, and are you being compensated for the capabilities of the New York Fire Department? How does that work?
They've signed an agreement to be a resource provider to the SMF providers.
And do you pay them or no?
Yes, sir. For their services, they're compensated for their services.
Okay. Okay. And so, and they have complementary capabilities to yours?
Basically, if a fire at the dock is the jurisdiction of the local fire department. So we support them at a fire at the dock. As the fire moves away from the dock into the port offshore, it switches. We take the lead offshore, so we have a mutual aid agreement. We support them. When the fire's at the dock, they support us as it moves away from the dock.
Okay, because in the case of the Gray Shark, I think that it took 4 days in that case to put that one out, and obviously that kind of time frame, if that were a vessel with passengers, would be incredibly concerning.
The Gray Shark started about 200 miles offshore, outside of the jurisdiction of everything. It was. I don't really want to talk specifically about cases. I'm an elected officer of the ASA, but I'm also, I work directly for one of the providers. So it was a competitor company that responded to that. I'm not going to address that specifically, but it started 200 miles offshore, outside the jurisdiction of the regulations. It was towed in. It was handled. The New York Fire worked together with the provider, and that's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
If I could say one thing, my comments have been limited to the response requirements, not the other 19 services provided by the salvage companies. I've limited my comments to those first 3 requirements: rapid response for firefighters and surveyors. That's what the subject of the alternative planning criteria I submitted to the Coast Guard addresses.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. And just to be clear, before I yield to Mr. Garamundi, I think the gentleman's point was that fire that occurred on the Gray Shark, they towed it back to the dock for 4 days, and then the fire department put out the fire at the dock. Right, so the salvers didn't put the fire out, I think is what he's saying, in the ocean, they brought it all the way back as it burned, and then the New York Fire Department put it out at the dock, like they put out a house fire. Is that right?
That's correct. And again, it's the specifics of the case I don't want to get into, but that's not an uncommon thing.
Okay,
to work on a fire
right.
at a place of safety where you can.
So, Admiral Thomas, then, is that why the regulation is there, so that happens?
Well,
I mean, is that what the Coast Guard envisioned when they put this in?
as Mr. Schauer mentioned, that particular incident occurred outside the jurisdictional limit of the law and the regulation in this case. So,
Okay, so say that it happened 20 miles offshore. Is it still is it the Coast Guard's intent then that you tow in the boats to the closest fire department at the dock, as opposed to putting the fire out in the ocean?
The Coast Guard regulations are not as prescriptive as to tell the salvage professionals the best way to put a fire out on a ship. There may be situations where that is, in fact, the best response, and there's others where the salvage professionals would determine bringing response resources to the vessel is best. But the regulations specify resource capabilities and timelines, but they are not prescriptive in which resources should be used when and who and how those decisions are made. That is made in consultation with the captain of port as a situation evolves.
Okay. I yield to the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for scheduling such an informative and necessary hearing. We've gone through this rapid response issue thoroughly. I have some questions, and I may ask them for the record with regard to that. But I would like to focus instead on this alliance business and the FMC response to it. It seems to me that what's happened here is there's been a very significant change in the nature of the industry since the last amendment to the Ocean Shipping Act, and that the FMC's authority and responsibilities no longer fit the reality of the industry. The emergence of all of the alliances and the significant power they have as a result of those alliances raises a question of antitrust, anti-competitive activity. I noticed, Mr. Butler, I was reading your testimony here, and you kindly gave us the specific sections of the alliance agreements, and you helpfully underlined those sections or those particular sentences that are to your benefit. For example, the parties shall negotiate independently, and the next 50 words are underlined, independently with stevedores, tug operators, and so on and so forth. And then there's this word provided. However, that specifically gives the alliances the opportunity to share information that is necessary to collude. And I'm going, something's wrong here. Because the specific, provided, however, the parties are authorized to discuss, exchange information, coordinate negotiations with the providers of services. Bottom line on all of this is the law is not up to date with the realities of the industry as it exists today. Our task is to address changes in the law as well as implementation of the law. It seems to me that the FMC can correctly argue that they're simply carrying out the law. We can debate whether that is or is not the case and whether they're carrying it out correctly. But I think there is no doubt in my mind that the current law is out of date and has to be changed. So my specific questions go to that task that we have of writing law. I want to start with Mr. Allegretti. How would you change the law to address the concerns that you have so ardently expressed to this committee?
The problem, Mr. Garamendi, with the current interpretation of the law is the Shipping Act has an explicit and express prohibition against foreign ocean carriers negotiating collectively with domestic service providers, except that it does exactly what you just said. And then it says, except or provided that it doesn't otherwise violate the antitrust laws. The problem with that in the real world is who's going to determine that these negotiations have violated the antitrust laws? Is the tugboat operator supposed to sue his customers under the antitrust laws to push back on this? Shall we rely on the Department of Justice to do it? Should we rely on the FMC to do it? These are not going to happen in the real world, and the result is that, in fact, the express prohibition in the law will be routinely violated in the marketplace.
So what change?
Then the change would be to take that provision out of the current statute that says, provided that it doesn't otherwise violate the antitrust laws.
Okay. So the removal of a specific section of law.
It is a phrase at the end of that section that has the express prohibition in it.
Mr. Corey, same question.
Congressman, I would have to take some time with our general counsel and with my fellow commissioners. I can't individually speak on behalf of the FMC. I don't have a formed opinion as to whether that would be a bad idea or not. I don't have a current opposition to considering it, but I would want to have a reasoned amount of input from all parties to see might there be some unintended consequences with that. But I can't say, as I sit here and give testimony today, Congressman, that I am opposed to that as a solution. So, you know, it's not that any of us, and I said this, you know, when we had a private meeting the other day at the commission, you know, the only degree I have on my wall is my United States Merchant Marine Officer's license as a master and first class pilot.
I appreciate that.
And we have others, so, you know, we have the sympathy.
Well,
but as you say, we have to work with the law.
Excuse me for interrupting, but I would like your opinion, I'd like the opinion of the commission as to how to address this problem of competition or lack thereof. So if you could respond to that question.
We will promptly prepare answers to all
We
of
are
the committee.
probably less than a month away of writing the new law for the Coast Guard Maritime. And so I would appreciate that in the next 2 weeks, if you would please provide that. Mr. Butler, the same question to you.
Mr. Garamendi, obviously, if the Congress wishes to amend the law, would be pleased to work with you in looking at language. That's the prerogative of the Congress to make that policy and make law. I would offer the perspective that the existing Shipping Act, as it was amended in 1998, did contemplate the kinds of activities that are going on today. I'm not so sure that we're in a position where we need to look at a major rewrite of the Shipping Act. I think there's enough authority and flexibility to deal with these issues. I would just note that the issue Mr. Allegretti has raised is very specific, and I understand you to be talking about perhaps broader issues. I think it's important to make that distinction.
Well, let me be very specific. Mr. Allegretti has proposed a specific change in the law, that a certain clause be eliminated. I assume you have not had the opportunity to opine on that, but take a run at it.
Well, I'd want to talk to Mr. Allegretti about what he's trying to accomplish. And we have had a conversation, and as I understand it, and he'll set me right if I get this wrong, I think what he's trying to have is a flat prohibition on joint negotiation for tug services.
Mr. Allegretti?
Can I try to put a more specific and practical perspective on what the problem is? There's a lot of conversation about law and analysis and competition. But here is the effect of what will happen if we don't change the law. And let me give you a practical example. You're a tugboat operator in a port somewhere in the United States. You have 3 major customers, and they each constitute, let's say, 25% of the business that you have in that port. Those 3 customers form an alliance, and they are given authorization by the FMC to come to you and jointly negotiate their rate. The first thing they do is they share the rate information, and they determine that one of them was paying $1,000, one was paying $1,500, one was paying $2,000. Well, the immediate thing they'll ask that tugboat operator for is give us all of the work at $1,000. Once they've done that, perhaps they'll say, and you know what, this is 75% of the business, maybe you ought to give it to us at $800. So if you're the tugboat operator and you're faced with this dilemma, you are now faced with either taking work at a non-compensatory rate that doesn't allow you to meet the cost of capital for your $15 million tug, for the crew that you provide family wages to, or the loss of 75% of the business that you enjoy in this port. We should not allow that to happen, Mr. Garamendi.
I very much appreciate your argument. It's clear to me, and I think to many members of this committee, that we have a situation evolving in which oligopoly power is in existence and can be used to the detriment of competition. pricing and a competitive environment. It seems to me that we need to modify the law, which is now almost 30 years old, so that we recognize the realities of the industry as it exists today. I'm particularly troubled by the language in the alliance, as Mr. Butler has presented to the committee, that allows the alliances to provide amongst themselves all the information they need to collude, independently, but nonetheless collude, prior to independent negotiations. I think that's wrong. I think we need to change the law. Mr. Allegretti, you've made a specific proposal as to how that might be done. I intend to pursue that. We will be writing a new authorization for the Coast Guard Maritime in the next month or so, and it would be my intent to try to address this issue by changing the law to require competition, or to set up a balance that would create competition and eliminate collusion. Now, that would be my intent, and I would appreciate, Mr. Corey, if you and the FMC commissioners would opine on that, and specifically on the language that Mr. Allegretti has proposed. Mr. Butler, if you would do the same, it would be very helpful. I yield back my time.
Thank the ranking member. So let me just go through this really quick. There's 3 issues here. One is firefighting and oil response. The second is the western capping of the port zone in Alaska. And let me apologize for Don Young not being here. Otherwise, Mr. Cussard and Mr. Candido would be much more, you'd be much more involved. I've been to Alaska once when I was 13. I went fishing with my dad. So we're gonna work on this and be in touch. Then the third is the FMC and collusion between shipping companies. So let's start with that one first, and then we'll go to the fire response. I'm just trying to drill down, because what the law says is that the FMC is required. It's basically you're looking out for consumers. So as long as the rates are low, and the stock at Walmart doesn't raise in price because of shipping prices, then you're happy, right? I mean, that's by law what you care about. It's because the law doesn't mention ports or tugs or terminals or any of that. It just mentions the shipping companies, right? And your job is to make sure that those prices stay low for the American people.
It is both price and service. So, adequate service to the consuming public is included in that.
And that means the availability of ships to export and to import, right?
Well, yes, but we do also regulate terminals. They are common. They produce common tariffs, et cetera, and they also fall within our jurisdiction. So,
but when it comes to this case, by law, you're looking at the availability of the ships to export and import, and low prices for the American people.
To see, as long as there's open competition, competition will obtain the best result. Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think that in the end, that's what we need to look at changing. If we're to make changes to this, so that the law can then prescribe to you that you are allowed to take in the interests of the American maritime industry, which is why you exist. I mean, you brought up the FTC, the Department of Transportation, the DOJ. I mean, if we have all that, then why do we really need the FMC? I mean, the reason you have an FMC is to look after, in my opinion, I think in the ranking members too, is to look after American interest when it concerns the maritime industry. But we're wrong, because that's not what the law says. That's just what we want.
Be happy to look at that. Again, the sympathy is with the sentiment that you express. If I could just take 1 second to make sure where we're moving from is Mr. Allegretti put together a hypothetical, not to get back down into the weeds, but to be clear, if the hypothetical that he gave on the record today was presented to us, I could look at my general counsel out there. It's 12:20. I bet you he could have an injunction on that hypothetical out of the U.S. District Court here in the District of Columbia before 5 o'clock today. What he described was a very clear abuse of market power. So it's not that we don't have power to address those issues when presented. So I don't want to go.
Am I correct, though? Am I correct in basically saying what the law allows you to do and prescribes for the FMC?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. Okay, so that's what we needed to drill down on. Admiral, let's get to the response vessel plan, response plans. If an oil carrying rig off of Alaska gave you a vessel response plan that was a plan that included vessels of opportunity, some of which might not even have oil containment or oil fighting, oil dispersion capability, would you accept that?
Well, we would look at the plan to ensure that it meets, in the case of Western Alaska, the alternative planning requirements that have been approved. And that may include some vessels of opportunity to meet some of the 19 functional requirements. But we would have, in the case of oil spill response, we'd have to make sure they meet the OPA requirements in one way or the other. It may include vessels of opportunity, but quite honestly, that is the case throughout the U.S., not just in Western Alaska.
Okay, so let's say in the Gulf, wherever they drill for oil, the Coast Guard would accept vessels of opportunity for those oil response plans?
For the purpose of salvage or oil?
For the purpose of oil spills, for cleaning it up and stopping fires and oil stuff.
Absolutely. We will look, we verify that an OSRO, who's listed on a vessel's response plan, has the capability that's required by the law. If they provide that capability through vessels of opportunity, that's common.
Okay, so let's go back and make this simple for me. You're saying if the vessels of opportunity have the correct gear on them to deal with an oil spill, and you verify that, then that's acceptable.
Well, again, there are many different functional requirements in the regulations. Mechanical recovery of oil is one. Those are specialized vessels, and those would have to be, specifically identified and not necessarily used as a vessel opportunity. But there are other functional requirements.
Okay, so let's just stop there then. So just that one out of the 19, that would require the vessel to be a specialized vehicle for oil response stuff, right?
Well, I don't want to confuse the salvage and marine firefighting regulations with the oil spill recovery regulations. They're both in OPA, but they're
right. But
the 19.
I don't want to either. We're not talking fire. We're talking oil.
Okay, so the 19 functional requirements are specified in the salvage and marine firefighting rules. So the oil spill regulations say you have to identify your worst case discharge and the resources required to respond to that. So for example, there may be a requirement to deploy boom. Deployment of boom is not going to require a highly specialized vessel, and that's a perfect opportunity for vessels of opportunity, particularly, for example, vessels that are normally in a port, working that port, to be identified in the plan as the resource which will deploy the boom. Now, the resource that will conduct mechanical recovery, if that's actually required by the plan, is usually a very highly specified or highly specialized resource, and that would have to be identified, and we would have to confirm that it's reasonably available in the timeline required.
Okay, and do you go by, do you look at those vessel response plans on oil spills? Do you look at those as planning requirements or performance requirements?
It's a planning requirement, sir. It's a worst case discharge planning requirement, and identify the resources that would be required.
So they can say, here's our plan, and then when it comes down to it, they don't really have anything, but that's okay because they had a plan for. Explain to me the difference between performance and planning requirements.
Well, so we require that you provide us a plan that meets certain planning factors and that you identify the resources that would be available to meet that plan. The difference is when it actually comes time to deploy those things, we don't go out and say, your plan said you'd be here in 6 hours, it took 7 hours. right? Because the performance didn't meet the plan. If it was in our judgment, when we approved the plan, you reasonably identified the resources and had the contracts in place to meet the performance requirements, we don't then come back and say, well, you know, it was 7 hours because there was traffic on I-95.
So is there a difference in your mind then? So now let's confuse the two, the oil spill and fire fighting.
It's easy to do.
Right? So what's the difference between the requirements, planning and performance requirements between those two? Or do you kind of see those the same way?
Well, the essential distance, with regard to oil spill response, you have to plan for a worst-case discharge from your facility, from your vessel, et cetera. And that drives the planning requirements because it says what kind of product am I carrying, how much might spill, et cetera. With regard to salvage and marine firefighting, you have to plan for the 19 functional requirements that are in the regulations. Things like deep sea towing, firefighting, you know, et cetera, removal, wreck removal.
So that means that the vessels that you choose, they have to have those capabilities, right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. In the case, yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I might, I had a meeting, conversation about a week ago with the response organization for San Francisco Bay. And they had completed, within the last month or so, a drill in which they tested the response for an oil spill and a fire within the bay. I think that's, if I recall from my experience as head of the State Lands Commission in California, that is uniform throughout the ports and some of the coast of California. As you get into the more remote areas, I don't think that's the case. But they do have a response plan, and they do exercise on a regular basis that response program. So I think it goes to the issue of both the plan and the capabilities. I can't speak for anywhere outside of the ports of California, which I'm familiar with, that happening. And I think the question that we're trying to get to here is it in other parts of the marine environment subject to American control, sufficient planning and then response as a result of that planning? And does the Coast Guard have the capability of having some reasonable level of assurance that it does exist? Admiral?
So the regulatory requirements are consistent, you know, throughout the U.S. and including in Western Alaska. And that includes the requirements for the plan holders to conduct exercises like those that you've had the opportunity to observe. The Coast Guard will oversee those exercises when our resources permit, but the fact remains that the responsibility to comply with that portion, with the exercise portion of the regulation, remains with the regulated entity or the plan holder. That includes both facilities and vessels, and that is a uniform requirement. The question about whether or not the Coast Guard uniformly verifies compliance with both the exercise requirement and whether or not we uniformly verify compliance with the availability of the identified resources, absolutely, we are resource constrained in our ability to do that. And we are also constrained in some ways by some legal requirements, but we're working hard to work our way around the country right now and complete those verifications.
I appreciate that, and my last 30 seconds here, because I think I know I have to go. I share the concern of Mr. Young about what's happened in Alaska and the way in which the western zone has been divided up and the effect that that would have on providing services in those areas that are not directly related to the Prince William Sound. So I'll let it go at that, share that comment with you. For those, I asked specifically for 3 people to respond to Mr. Allegretti's point, and anybody else that wants to chime in, here we are. Look forward to that. Mr. Chairman, a most useful committee hearing. Thank you so much.
Thank the ranking member, and this has been a marathon setting here, so we'll finish really quickly. Back to the firefighting response stuff. Admiral, I just read, John showed me the 155.4030B. You do put in there, you have time frames, right? You say you have to have fire suppression, You do on-site assessment, then you have timeframes for inside of 12 miles or inside of 50 miles. And you have to have external vessel firefighting systems and external firefighting teams, right? That's Coast Guard regulation, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when you established that, just walk me through this. So you have that, then you say, however, if you don't have that and just have a good plan, and you list vessels of opportunity that may or may not have this capability, that may or may not be able to meet this time frame, walk me through that, then that's okay. Because it's just for planning purposes, and it's not oil spill stuff, it's just a fire.
So I'll try to clarify, Congressman. I'm sorry that I confused this issue. When we review a plan, we review the plan to ensure that they have made provisions via contract or otherwise for the resources that are required by the regulation and the response times that are required by the regulation. So their plan says, here's how I meet that 6-hour requirement for firefighting, and here's who is going to provide that service for me. And we review the plan. We do what we can to establish that these arrangements are in fact true. And in the case of salvage and marine firefighting, most of those come through the 4 big agreements that are out there. And then, so that's how we approve the plan. We do make sure that they have in fact identified a vessel that can fight fire.
Chairman.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you,
Please.
Chairman. Just to clarify now we're operational guys. A fire is fought in a certain way. The way we look at it, similar to oil spill response, we use specialized equipment. We can't park, because we can't afford 200 fireboats everywhere, it would cost prohibitive. We take specialized equipment, portable equipment, large capacity pumps, large capacity monitors, storages of foam. We put them in depots around the country, 25 depots. We have a big fire offshore. Okay, we have the specialized people and equipment to do the fire. We just need something to transport it out there. Okay, we need, and the problem with what's being presented is that it's trying to do 2 things at once. Carrying passengers and being set up to handle a big fire, 2 different things. Carrying the people offshore, that's a taxi cab service. Okay, not a big deal. We're concerned about when we get there, having the assets, taking those big pumps, big monitors. We can put remote monitors on top of the wheelhouses of big tugboats, big offshore supply vessels, and direct the foam and water on the fire. That's effective operational response. So it's not about just one little taxi cab with a fire pump. It's about the system we use, and that's how we do it. That's how we do it cost effectively, with the portable specialized equipment loaded on vessels of opportunity.
Mr. Newell, go ahead.
If I could comment, I think that the question that you posed is a very, very good one, and I want to go back to something you said earlier. You were concerned that it took 4 days to put out the fire in the Gray Shark. I should point out that it also took 4 days to put out the fire in the Caribbean Fantasy. That fire broke out within 2 nautical miles of the pierheads in San Juan, and the San Juan Fire Department put that fire out as well. I think if you go back to the transcript of the hearings that were held in San Juan with the National Transportation Safety Board and the Coast Guard, you'll find that the firefighting response was wholly inadequate. I cited in my comments that the Coast Guard has already concluded it was not compliant. And the reason it's not compliant is that, again, relying on a vessel opportunity works in some instances. However, in this instance, if your plan cites certain vessels of opportunity to respond, and they do not, they're transient and they're not in the captain of the port zone, for example, then you do not have an adequate plan from my perspective. And my criticism of the Coast Guard is they haven't gone back to verify that a vessel entering harbor, let's say Charleston, lists 30 vessels as its vessels of opportunity to respond. However, none of those are located within the captain of the port zone. I do not think that's an adequate plan. And because the Coast Guard, as Admiral Thomas has pointed out, lacks the resources to do this type of verification, we have time and time again instances where the resources simply aren't available. We bring spent plutonium into Charleston under the MOX Treaty. In that instance, you would think that we would have at least a dedicated resource or ensure that resources are within the captain of the port zone to address that in the event of a fire. And I'm surprised that the Coast Guard has not taken it upon themselves to review our alternative planning criteria where we do propose to provide a high-speed fireboat. Mr. Schaller is correct. The high-speed fireboats that we've proposed in the 20th largest ports in the United States would not necessarily put the fire out. We need those salvage community. We need them to bring those heavy assets. But to meet the response requirements in these strict timeframes that you alluded to, Chairman, that would require a high-speed special purpose fireboat, which we've proposed to provide in the 20 largest ports in the United States. Thank you.
Admiral, so let's end with you on this. What is I guess put it this way, is the Coast Guard happy with the way that things are? Because there is a clear delineation between what you require for oil spills, which might kill some fish, and fires, which may kill some people. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get to, because you require all this stuff for oil spills, because we all love the climate and it's, you know, the ocean's great. But when it comes to people, you require whatever can be available at whatever's available, basically. And you do make that difference.
Sir, I think the Coast Guard would like to see more robust response capability around our nation for both oil and salvage and marine firefighting. And it's clear that the congressional intent when we were directed to implement the regulations was to build that capacity.
But the author of the regulation is here, by the way. Yeah.
And I would say that we are achieving that goal, probably not as fast as some in this room would like to see. The Coast Guard, as you know, is constantly in the position of balancing the need to ensure that ships can continue to move in and out our ports, and that we raise the bar with regard to safety and environment, et cetera. This is a case where our measured implementation and our measured compliance or enforcement is helping to build the capacity envisioned by Congress, but we can't turn it on overnight. In the case of the fast response boats, there's nothing in our regulation or in the law that prevents them from entering the market, from offering that service to a regulated entity, in this case a ship operator. What they're asking us to do, essentially, is to require that product be purchased by a regulated entity. And we may, in fact, get to that point if in the course of our verification, we determine that the salvage assets that are out there really don't meet the national planning criteria. And so, as requested, we're going to lower those criteria in a way that then would allow the regulated ship plan holders to be in compliance by purchasing this substitute service. But we haven't gotten there yet, sir.
But tell me, but why do you differentiate between oil spills and fires on ships in the types of vessels, the specialized vessels that you require to be on hand, on standby?
I think that the type of assets that are required for oil spills are different. The regulatory regimes were put in place on different timelines. The industry's matured differently. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the salvage industry was so anxious to get these regulations in place, because they saw what OPA did in terms of our national capacity to respond to oil spills, and thought that that's what the nation needs for other contingencies as well.
Yes, sir.
Chairman, just maybe a quick clarification. Salvage and firefighting, 19 different services. It's wholly different than responding to an oil spill. Responding to an oil spill is we all pretty much understand what you do. You contain it and you skim it out of the water. You could have, for salvage and firefighting, it's any manner of casualties. I described some of them. It could be fires, explosions, sinking the vessel's already sunk, removing fuel underwater, removing the wreck, needing big heavy lift assets. So it's the diversification of what we have to do is so large that it's not really comparable, because it's oil spill, you can pretty much focus down on what you need and, okay, we'll dedicate most of them. It's too big. It's too big a problem. And we're trying to meet it by best use of specialized assets versus or alongside of the vessels of opportunity.
So I guess getting down to it, the last question, the really, really last question, why do you have these in there, the planning standards, if there's no real requirement for someone to perform to them?
Well, sir, the way the regulation is construed or constructed is to require, or it is intended to build our capacity to respond by requiring the regulated entity, in this case mostly foreign vessel operators, to contract with service providers. It's not intended to regulate those service providers. In other words, we're not going to go after the salver and said, you say you'd be there in 6 hours, you didn't get here to 8, here's your ticket. So I think that's a key difference. But what this boils down to, sir, is our capability to get out there and verify with some degree of robustness that the capability identified by the regulated entity actually exists. And if it doesn't, to hold them, the plan holder, the ship operator, responsible. But we have to do that in a way, sir, that doesn't all of a sudden stop vessel traffic in the U.S. And I think that's why you're seeing a measured approach to our verification, and then we'll come up with the best solution in terms of how to build the capacity intended by the regulation. It might be an alternative planning criteria, but quite honestly, that would lower the national standard. I'm not sure why we'd want to do that, but we're in the course of really working through those issues.
Why? I mean, every ship that goes out is insured. why don't, in your opinions, why don't the insurers require the planning criteria to really be performance criteria to save their asset?
I think one of the reasons, and I think that most of the panel members here would agree, is because the Coast Guard has not been aggressively enforcing the compliance.
No, but just in the marketplace, why don't they care? The insurers.
I can't answer that question, sir. Certainly, I know they begin to care when the Coast Guard begins to hurt them by holding their ship up, et cetera. And that's what aggressive enforcement will do.
Okay. I think that's it for me. Everybody, thank you very much. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your patience. Hearing is adjourned.